Every relationship has a moment where doubt slips in quietly. Mine arrived the night my husband canceled again, and I realized I'd already braced for it. I sat in my car with the headlights off, parked along the curb across from the cafe. The neon sign in the window flickered between open and closed like it couldn't make up its mind. The clock on the dashboard read 7:12. I'd arrived early on purpose. I always did. Part of me still believed that if I showed up on time, if I waited patiently enough, things would work out the way they used to. I told myself he'd be there any minute. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Still, my eyes kept drifting to my phone resting in the cup holder, silent. I adjusted the collar of my coat and checked my reflection in the side mirror. I'd chosen it carefully, nothing flashy, just familiar. The kind of outfit that said I still care, even if I didn't know who I was proving that to anymore. Through the cafe windows, I could see couples already seated, leaning in close, sharing drinks, laughing without effort. They moved like people who didn't question whether they belonged where they were. I felt something settle in my chest then. Not panic, not surprise, just a quiet heaviness I couldn't shake. My phone lit up. I didn't pick it up right away. I already knew what it would say. I watched the screen glow, the name flashing like a warning I'd learned to ignore. When I finally opened the message, my breath left me in one slow exhale. Another apology. Another explanation about a late meeting that ran longer than expected. Another promise to make it up to me soon. The words blurred together because I'd read versions of them before. Enough times that they no longer landed like excuses, just routine. I typed back a short reply. Okay. Be careful getting home. I didn't mention how long I'd been sitting there. I didn't ask if he was telling the truth. I didn't say how this was starting to feel. That version of me had learned when silence was easier. I stayed parked longer than necessary, watching strangers step inside the cafe, watching the door close behind them. No one hesitated. No one checked their phone twice before walking in. They all seemed sure they were exactly where they were supposed to be. What caught me off guard wasn't the disappointment. It was how familiar it felt. There was no sting, no sharp sense of betrayal. Just exhaustion. Like my heart had adjusted its expectations long before my mind was ready to admit it. And that realization sat heavier than the empty seat beside me ever could. I finally turned the key and pulled away without ever opening the door to the cafe. The drive home felt slower, quieter. My phone stayed face down on the passenger seat. I didn't want to see it light up again. At a red light, alone in the car, I asked myself something I'd been avoiding for a long time. When did waiting patiently turn into waiting numb? I turned onto my block, knowing this night wasn't really about a missed dinner. It was about how normal the letdowns had become, and what that said about the life I was slowly, silently settling into. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something. If you already expect to be disappointed, is it still love, or is it just habit? The morning after the canceled dinner, I drove to work without turning anything on. No music, no voices, just the low hum of traffic and the sound of my own thoughts pressing in. At a stoplight downtown, memories began lining up in my head without warning, moments I'd filed away as harmless at the time. Anniversaries cut short because a call couldn't wait. Weekend plans shifted to maybe next month. Conversations that ended with "we'll talk later" and never found their way back. None of it had raised alarms on its own. Each moment had a reasonable explanation. His job was demanding. He carried a lot of responsibility. Life wasn't simple anymore. That's what I told myself. But sitting there, inching forward in traffic, I saw it clearly for the first time. These weren't isolated incidents. They were chapters of the same story. I'd spent years stitching over the gaps, answering questions before anyone asked them, reassuring people he cared even when he wasn't around. I called it being supportive. I called it commitment. I never called it what it really was, compensation. Later that day, I stopped at a small market on my way home. I moved through the aisles on autopilot, reaching for the things he liked without thinking. The cereal he always bought. The creamer he insisted tasted better. My basket filled with evidence of how well I'd learned to anticipate him. And then it hit me. I couldn't remember the last time he'd done the same for me. Mark had always been good at explaining his absence in respectable terms. Duty, stability, providing for our future. Those words had carried me for a long time. I'd repeated them to friends, to family, even to myself. He's doing his best, I'd say. He's just under a lot of pressure. Standing there under fluorescent lights, I realized something uncomfortable. Responsibility had become a shield, one that protected him from having to show up emotionally. And without meaning to, I'd helped reinforce it. That night, I lay awake beside him while he slept. The room was dim, shadows stretching across the walls. His breathing was steady, untroubled. I stared at the ceiling and let a question surface that I'd buried for years. When did endurance become my role in this marriage? Somewhere along the way, being understanding had turned into being quiet. Supporting him had meant needing less. I told myself that was maturity. That betrayal love didn't demand attention. That wanting more made me weak. But lying there, I felt the cost of everything I'd stopped asking for. A few days later, I met Claire for lunch near her office. She asked how things were going, and for once, I didn't reach for the safe answer. I told her I felt alone. I told her it felt like my life was on pause, waiting for someone who might not notice if it started without him. She listened without interrupting, fingers curled around her glass. Then she asked something simple that landed harder than I expected. "Do you feel like you have a partner?" she said. "Or do you feel like you're carrying this by yourself?" I didn't respond right away, because the answer was already there. By myself. Claire didn't push. She didn't tell me what to do. She just said one thing that followed me all the way home. "Being patient shouldn't cost you your presence," she said. "And love shouldn't require you to keep shrinking." Driving back, her words replayed over and over. I thought about how often I'd chosen calm over honesty, how many times I'd swallowed my feelings to keep the peace. And that's when it finally clicked. I'd been defending his absence more than he ever had. I was the one smoothing things over, adjusting expectations, carrying the emotional weight so he wouldn't have to notice it. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I didn't feel angry. I wasn't ready to confront anyone. I just felt clear. And clarity has a way of making the next moment impossible to ignore. Before I tell you what finally pushed me past that point, let me ask you, how do you know when patience stops being strength and starts costing you who you are? It was already dark when Marcus knocked. I hadn't been expecting anyone. He was only stopping by to drop off a jacket my husband had left in his car days earlier. I almost didn't answer. I was still in the same clothes I'd been wearing since morning, sitting in the quiet, telling myself I didn't need company. When I opened the door, he hesitated, just a fraction of a second, long enough to notice. "You all right?" he asked carefully. Not like someone fishing for details, like someone who already sensed the weight in the room. I shrugged and stepped aside. I didn't say come in. I just moved and he understood. We sat on opposite ends of the couch. Space between us. Distance that felt intentional. I expected him to hand me the jacket, make a polite excuse and leave. That's what most people do when they sense something heavy. They retreat. But Marcus stayed. He didn't rush to fill the silence. Didn't ask questions that felt invasive. He just sat there, hands resting on his knees, giving the quiet room permission to stay quiet. That patience did something to me. I started talking without meaning to. About the missed dinner. About how often plans fell apart. About how tired I was of explaining things away, of pretending it didn't hurt. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to fix anything. He didn't tell me what I should do. He listened. And somewhere in the middle of that, my chest tightened. Not from sadness, but from recognition. I couldn't remember the last time someone had listened like that. Fully. Without distraction. Without looking for an exit. The words came slowly at first. Then they spilled out. I talked about how quiet the house felt most nights. How I'd stopped sharing my thoughts because timing never seemed right. How being married didn't stop you from feeling alone, it just made it harder to admit. Marcus didn't look uncomfortable. He didn't look surprised. He just nodded, like he understood more than I wanted him to. That understanding felt like relief. And like danger. Nothing happened. Not even close. But the comfort settled in my body in a way that felt unfamiliar. Steady. Grounding, human. And that scared me. After he left, the silence in the house felt louder than before. I stayed on the couch, replaying the conversation, searching for a moment where I'd crossed a line. I couldn't find one, and still guilt crept in. Not because I'd done something wrong, but because of how easily it had happened. How natural it felt to open up. How little effort it took to feel seen. That realization hurt more than the loneliness ever had, because it meant I'd been living without something essential for a long time. I went to bed that night knowing something had shifted, not between Marcus and me, between the life I was living and the one I'd been telling myself was enough. The boundary I thought would be tested never was. Instead, I was left facing a harder truth. If a single conversation could make me feel this understood, what did that say about my marriage? And what did it mean that I'd been surviving without that feeling for so long? Before I tell you what happened when I finally carried this back into my home, let me ask you this. If comfort alone can feel this powerful, where do you draw the line? I waited until the house settled into its usual quiet. The counters were clean. The dishwasher hummed softly. The overhead light cast a dull glow across the kitchen. Aaron stood near the sink, scrolling through his phone, relaxed in a way that made my chest ache. He looked comfortable, unbothered, like this was just another ordinary night. "I need to talk to you," I said. He glanced up, mildly surprised but not concerned. That should have warned me. Concern only comes when someone already knows there's something wrong. I told him I felt lonely, not in a dramatic way, not accusing, just honest. I said I felt like I'd been waiting for him for years, not for dates or plans, but for presence, for attention that wasn't squeezed in between obligations. I chose my words carefully, trying to explain the feeling instead of listing every moment that built it. At first, I felt a flicker of hope, because he was listening. Then he exhaled, not sharply, not angrily, just a small sigh, the kind people let out when they're preparing to be inconvenienced. "I don't really understand why this is such a big deal," he said. "I'm doing everything I can." The words landed heavy and hollow. I told him I knew he worked hard, that I didn't take what he provided for granted, but that being responsible wasn't the same as being present. That love couldn't survive on logistics alone. He rubbed his temple, like he was trying to stay patient. "Everyone's stretched thin," he said. "This is just adulthood." Something tightened in my chest. Because he wasn't hearing me. He was filing my pain under normal frustration. He started listing his schedule. Meetings. Deadlines. Pressure. He talked about sacrifice and stability, about how everything he did was for our future. "This is how I show love," he said, "by making sure we're secure." And I realized he meant it. To him, love was measurable. Bills paid. Responsibilities handled. A steady routine. Showing up in ways that could be quantified. I asked him when we'd last talked without distraction. When we'd last sat together without one of us glancing at a screen or checking the time. He paused, then shrugged. "I think you're reading too much into this," he said. "You're overthinking." That's when the frustration finally broke through. I told him it wasn't about one missed night or one broken plan. It was about years of coming second, about shrinking my expectations so disappointment wouldn't hurt as much, about learning to live with absence as if it were normal. He looked genuinely puzzled. "I've never betrayed you," he said. "I've never crossed a line." And that was the moment everything shifted. Because we weren't arguing about actions. We were arguing about meaning. I asked him if neglect could still be a form of harm. He didn't answer right away. Then he said quietly, "I don't see it that way." There was no shouting, no slammed doors, just calm. And somehow, that calm cut deeper than anger ever could. Because it told me he didn't see my loneliness as damage, just discomfort. Something manageable. Something I was expected to endure. I felt the hope drain out of me, replaced by something heavier. Not rage. Not heartbreak. Just devastation. Not because he didn't care, but because the way he cared left no space for what I needed. The realization settled between us like something final. I stopped talking. Not because I'd run out of words, but because I finally understood something I'd been avoiding. We were using the same language, but the word love meant entirely different things to each of us. And if that gap stayed where it was, I didn't know what it would cost me next. Standing there in the quiet kitchen, I realized the real question wasn't whether he'd hurt me. It was whether I was willing to keep living this way now that I could finally name it. That night, I slept in the spare room. Not out of anger. Not to punish him. I just needed enough quiet to hear myself again. The room felt unfamiliar in a way that was oddly grounding. No shared routines. No unspoken expectations hanging in the air. When the morning light slipped through the blinds, I noticed something that startled me. I hadn't woken up tense. I hadn't rehearsed disappointment before my feet hit the floor. And for the first time in a long while, I stopped replaying the conversation. I stopped trying to translate my feelings into language he might accept. I stopped debating facts that would never mean the same thing to both of us. Instead, I asked myself a simpler question. What do I actually need to stay whole? When Aaron and I talked again, it wasn't explosive. It wasn't dramatic. It was clear. I didn't accuse him. I didn't keep score. I didn't ask him to see things the way I did. I told him I needed presence, attention, emotional availability. I told him that being endlessly understanding had slowly cost me parts of myself I didn't want to lose. There were no ultimatums, no timelines, just honesty. I wasn't asking him to change who he was overnight. I was telling him what I would no longer minimize to make the relationship easier to maintain. And for the first time, I didn't soften the truth to protect his comfort. Something shifted after that. Not in a way you could point to. Not all at once. But I felt it. I stopped shrinking to avoid tension. I stopped managing emotions that weren't mine to carry. I trusted the quiet voice inside me, the one that had been whispering for years while I was busy explaining everything away. That voice had been right. The marriage didn't end. But it didn't stay the same either. It moved into something more honest. Whether that honesty would hold, I didn't yet know. There was no clean resolution. No dramatic turning point. Just awareness, the kind you can't unlearn once it settles in. I finally understood the truth. Comfort wasn't what threatened my marriage. Silence was. Pretending I didn't need more almost erased me. That was the real cost. And I wasn't willing to pay it anymore. I don't know how this marriage will end, or if it will. But I do know this. I won't disappear inside it again. Some betrayals aren't loud. Some boundaries aren't obvious. And some relationships survive absence longer than they should. If this story unsettled you, you're not alone. This is just one truth. There are more like it on Deception Diaries. Stories about emotional neglect, blurred lines, and the quiet choices that change everything. Let me ask you one last question. How much absence do you think love can survive?